I feel like in the past year, I've heard a lot of mixed thoughts about Final Fantasy XVI. From it's not Final Fantasy, to the ending was bad, to the ending left me in tears. I think this is a good reminder that it's good to play the games yourself and form your own opinion. So is Final Fantasy XVI everything that people say it is? Let's talk about the presentation a bit. Square Enix is a company that really used to love their presentation. Their games were always a step ahead graphically, especially Final Fantasy. I'm glad to say that FF continues to be one of Square's crown jewels in terms of visuals. The amount of detail is jaw-dropping, and every cinematic feels like it belongs in a movie. Notably, there are huge set pieces as well, and the team behind the game knows exactly what they want to do with them. The world itself is not open, and most of the areas are pretty linear. Even when they do open up, they don't really give you a ton of space to explore. The game compensates this by giving you these gloriously well-made cinematic set pieces, as well as some beautiful environments. Every icon fight is a combination of gameplay and cutscenes, and to some people, that might very well be a turnoff. I mean, I'm playing a video game, shouldn't I be pressing the buttons to do things? But I think in some sense it turns these spectacles into what they're meant to be. Even the simpler cutscenes are beautiful, and the level of detail on the characters' expressions does so much for the emotional value of every scene. Whether you're looking at visuals, voice acting, or music, this game does it all near to perfection. Square continues to show me that they still know how to do presentation and can be at the top of their game, even with some rather questionable releases. And of course, combat is the crown jewel of what sets people off and what appeals to people the most about this game. Over the past decade and some, Square has allowed Final Fantasy to test run different ideas, but ultimately, in my eyes, the main series always seemed to be setting into a real-time action combat system. I'm not here to argue whether that's a good or bad thing for the series, though. 16's combat is a spectacle to behold. It focuses down into one character, Clive, and expands his arsenal of skills as the game progresses. Instead of giving you access to multiple characters and having to flesh out each individual moveset, the game focuses entirely on the fact that you'll be playing as Clive. You start off really only being able to do some simple sword strikes, but the game quickly gives you access to all sorts of fancy skills. And once you obtain additional icon abilities, you can start forming a lot of fancy strings and doing some fun combos. That said, this game still limits you. This part is a very personal opinion, it's not objective. You can cycle through different icons to access different skills. You can have a total of 9 skills equipped at any time. Now what is my issue with this? My issue is that why can't we just have access to all the icons? You know, scrolling through 9 options would be incredibly time consuming, I understand, but I at least wish the game placed fewer limits on the player. For me, what wound up happening is that I was sticking to what I knew rather than trying out new things. When you're so limited on options, despite being given access to a wealth of abilities, it just doesn't feel like a great idea for me to go out of my way to try all this new stuff when the old stuff still works, and works pretty well. I would have liked to have access to at least 2 abilities per icon at any given time, rather than give up on things I already knew worked. This especially came into play when it came to some of the icons you get later in the game. I felt like ones like the Phoenix, Titan, and Garuda all gave abilities that felt pretty vital to Clive's overall function. And they're technically not, but at the point I was at in the game, I was so used to using those that I didn't want to swap off of them. Either way, it's important for me to keep in mind, and important probably for you to keep in mind, that this still is a JRPG. It's not a full-fledged action game. The game balance is going to be considered as opposed to letting you bulldoze enemies with 8 different skills. While the combat designer from DMC5 is there, this game is not Devil May Cry. At the end of the day, my primary complaint about this is just that I wish there was a little bit more freedom to have more expression in how you play Clive, as opposed to this very limiting combat style that just made me not really want to switch off the abilities I knew. The actual combat, though, is pretty satisfying. Blocking with Titan feels especially good when you time it right, and a lot of strong attacks do make Clive feel powerful. Some fights feel a little HP spongy, but as I've said in other situations, An improper HP pool would just make some boss fights feel less like bosses. On the other hand, you have icon battles. These fights are more cinematic set pieces than anything else. The game makes pretty good use of these segments, but I will say that there's a point where this peaks, and after that it really only goes down. None of the fights after feel bad, but they definitely feel simpler. Ifrit doesn't have a huge arsenal of moves to use, which is kind of a shame. It would have been really cool to have Ifrit integrate the other icons into his combat, since, again, that is part of the whole story, that's part of the whole narrative. And being able to use other icon abilities as Ifrit just would have been neat. But instead, Ifrit has a very limited moveset. It is what it is. And due to this limitation, playing the endgame as Ifrit feels a lot less rewarding than playing through as Clive. 16's combat definitely has some peaks and a few valleys. In some moments, it feels great and well crafted, while in others, it can feel a bit limiting and a little bit dry. I still really enjoyed the gameplay, but I do wish that there were fewer limitations placed on the player, because that would make this game shine a bit brighter. After finishing this game, I can say that I do understand why some people have more negative reactions to the ending and the ending segments of the game. Before I go into that, for most of the story, the world seems small. Destroying the mother crystals and building a world that frees people from the blight and discrimination would be great. The early game gives you a heavy dose of how bearers are treated despite their affinity for magic. They brand them and use them until they're dead. The bearers are nothing more than tools to regular people, and if a child is a bearer, some parents will leave that kid for dead or to be sold. It's a horrible system, and the game has no shortage of blatant examples of the mistreatment of these people. In a lot of ways, the narrative is better for it. Racism is not subtle, and people who are racist are not afraid to voice their thoughts, especially when those thoughts are shared by a majority of people. And this focus on bearers and crystals remains throughout the narrative. The start of 16 really does kind of feel like a political drama, with the conflict of war rising constantly. In some ways, it might give you an impression that you're going in one direction, but the game will shift you in another pretty soon after. You might think you'll be going into these huge battles with these giant armies, and each side will have an icon and it'll be a great big spectacle. That's not going to happen. For me, the overall narrative was great. It had some really strong emotional beats, and some weaker subplots, but after completing all the side quests, a majority of those storylines even had me hooked. And that's another nice thing about this game, is that the side quests, while they can feel pretty simplistic in the terms of the tasks you're given, they do play a pretty big role in building the world and building this community. If you don't do them, you're missing pretty major parts of the world itself and the influence that Clive has. But I can understand not always feeling engaged by them. They're not necessary, but they feel important, and I think that's what counts for a good side quest. Now, in the next part, I'm gonna talk about the ending, so if you haven't finished the game, I recommend skipping ahead.
Kill yourself.
So, Final Fantasy XVI ends on a very somber note. I've noticed over the past few years that a lot of people do not like open-ended stories. And going into 15 really quick about the ending, it's kind of the same, with it ending without any sort of epilogue. It's just bam, and it's over. 16 follows this to some extent, ending in a somewhat tragic fashion as well. Clive laying on the beach, slowly turning to stone. But the question remains, is he dead? And I think the game purposely leaves that a little open to your interpretation. There are a few things hinting at the possibility that he isn't, but there's no concrete proof that he isn't. Final Fantasy and many stories use a lot of symbolism, so you can interpret things one way or another. I don't think I'm really obsessed with the ending, but I don't think it's bad either. One thing I didn't totally enjoy as much as everything else is Ultima. Ultima's not a bad villain, and he does kind of act as a foil to Clive's character, but I'm also not super interested in him as a whole. One of the things about these characters who look really uncanny and kind of creepy is that when you start to give them personality, the intimidation factor definitely fades a little bit sometimes. And that kind of happened to me with Ultima. A lot of the game, I was just waiting for the moment we get to put Clive's mother in her place, and thankfully Dion does that for us, because that woman can go straight to hell. I hate that girl. Anyways, Ultima is just a character I wasn't that into. I don't wish for the story to be any different, though. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't try to sympathize with him, or maybe we do a little bit, but he's just not that interesting to me. Again, I don't think he's bad, I just didn't like him personally.
Elden Ring DLC.
As for 16's DLC, Rising Tide and Echoes of the Fallen, they are good. Rising Tide is definitely more of the crown jewel here for me. Getting to know what happened to Leviathan and why Ultima didn't push us to gain his power is a good way to have a side story that has little consequence to the main plot without really seeming out of place. I saw some people ranting a bit about the Leviathan boss fight, but I didn't really think it was that bad. Maybe on Final Fantasy mode it's harder, I'd assume that's the case. But the overall experience for me was fine. The window on breaking his shield for his giant attack still gave me decent room for error, even if I did finish it with 1 moment remaining. Echoes of the Fallen is definitely the big side quest material, but it does give perspective into why the game has all these robot-like creatures running around. It might appear in the lore menu as well, but I really didn't read into that too much. Either way, 2 decently chunky pieces of DLC, and if you're going to be playing through the game, or at least are enjoying yourself currently while playing through the game, I see no reason not to play these as well. Also, both bosses in this DLC are way more difficult than the final boss, which can kind of trivialize that, since they only are playable right before the end of the game. But either way, 2 very solid DLC episodes for this game, and I'm more than happy that I played through them.
I reckon he likes you.
Final Fantasy XVI is not a perfect game, but it is a spectacular one. Like any video game, it has its flaws. A creative work with so many people working on it is never going to be flawless. But that's a good thing, because in its own way, it shows that the different hearts and minds that went into the creation of this created something great. I really enjoyed my time with this game, despite running on a clock to finish it, because yeah. But truly, Final Fantasy XVI is a very good game, and I hope Square can finally get their act together and continue to produce games that they're known for, rather than shoveling out this NFT and live service nonsense they've been doing for the past few years in the mix of all their games. I still hold a very, very strong grudge about this Avengers game. How did you mess that up? Whoever it was, Disney, Marvel, Square, probably all 3 of you in some way, you guys really, really blew it on that one. Anyways, if you have any thoughts about Final Fantasy XVI, its story, its ending, the DLC, any of it at all, leave it in the comments down below. As always, you can leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to the channel for more things anime RPG related, JRPG related. I don't know if we'll come back to Final Fantasy, it really depends, because it probably will take some time before the next mainline one. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
This should help. Hogenberg got them right. I will fight with pride. Let's try this.